Good afternoon, everyone. And time to switch gears, I suppose, to talk about carbon offsets. I'm going to kick things off by talking about, I guess, what you could call some best practices, maybe some caveats as well in terms of the experience that we've had in California with the emissions trading scheme there and the carbon offsets program in particular. First, maybe a few words about my organization. So the Climate Action Reserve, or CAR, is actually a nonprofit NGO that was initially established by the state of California under state legislation in 2001. And we were created with the purpose of helping to promote early action in reducing greenhouse gas emissions in California. So we were there to serve as kind of an independent vehicle that companies could work with to register their emissions and emission reductions. And over the years, we've developed a series of standards, protocols for carbon offsets, and we've, for the past 8 years, operated a full-fledged voluntary carbon offset program. So overseeing verification, issuing credits in the voluntary carbon offset market. But the unique aspect of the California program is that several of the standards that we developed for 5 different project types have now been incorporated into the California compliance program, and credits that we've issued in these categories are convertible into compliance units at this point. So it's kind of a unique relationship in California between the voluntary and the compliance markets. So quickly, just an overview of the California emissions trading scheme. It began in 2013. It's a statewide cap on greenhouse gas emissions. The program runs through 2020, and it's kind of the cornerstone effort in California to reduce emissions to 1990 levels by 2020. California has implemented a wide range of other policies and measures for reducing emissions, but the cap ensures that that target will be met. The scheme is divided into 3 compliance periods. So the first one just came to an end in 2013-2014. That initial stage focused only on large industrial emitters, so power plants and other large industrial facilities. This year, the program has expanded to cover 85% of the total greenhouse gas emissions in California, and that's CO2, methane, N2O, basically the 6 Kyoto Protocol gases. So it covers transportation fuels upstream and also natural gas at the point of distribution. So a pretty comprehensive program, perhaps one of the most comprehensive ETS schemes in the world. So with respect to offsets, up to 8% of an entity's or a facility's compliance obligation can be fulfilled with offsets. So this table here shows you what the allowance budget looks like in California, and then in that final column what that would translate to in terms of maximum demand for offsets. So that the maximum potential demand, if every company were to use their full allotment or quota of offsets, would be around 200 million tons of reductions. For a number of reasons, we're probably not going to get there in terms of there being available supply or even demand for those offsets. Basically, at this point, California, I would not say is greatly over-allocated, as we've seen in some other ETS schemes like the EU, for example. But it's right now the cap is fairly lenient in terms of not driving a lot of demand for allowances and carbon offsets. So California has taken a unique approach to carbon offsets in a number of different ways. I've described kind of the background with my organization, But one key difference between California and, say, the Kyoto Protocol mechanisms in the EU is that we've taken a top-down approach to developing the standards, the methodologies, or what we call protocols. So what that means is under our approach, under my program and the California program, it's not possible as a project developer to come forward with a proposed new methodology and have that reviewed and approved by the regulators. Instead, what we have done is identify what we thought were promising project types with a lot of potential for cost-effective emission reductions, and we've developed protocols in those categories. So it's been a much more limited number of project types that are eligible under the program, certainly relative to the nearly 200, I think, methodologies developed under the CDM. And there were a couple reasons for this. One was, when we, the Climate Action Reserve, were developing these protocols, we did have this intention of creating something that was regulatory quality and that would pass muster with the Air Resources Board in California and the regulators there. And so we wanted to develop these protocols using a public process. All of the standards have been developed with input from a wide range of stakeholders, including industry, environmental groups, academia, and other experts. So that was one reason for taking this approach. The other was we've developed standards in a different way from the methodologies that you see under the Clean Development Mechanism, and specifically we've tried to adopt standardized approaches. If you're familiar with the CDM, this is something that's gaining some traction internationally to develop and adopt standardized baselines. In California, all of our protocols follow a standardized baseline approach. And in particular, when we're dealing with this question of additionality, would a project have happened in the absence of the program or not, we determine that using eligibility criteria rather than going through a project-by-project detailed analysis of the finances or the barriers facing the project. So that makes the process much more streamlined, but it's been a lot more work up front to develop the protocols, and we've had to do it in this top-down fashion. So these here are the 5 project types that are currently eligible in the California program: forestry, and 3 different subtypes under forestry. There's an urban forest protocol that, quite frankly, has gotten 0 uptake at this point, but that concerns urban tree planting. Destruction of ozone-depleting substances, so this is a protocol for destroying gases that are regulated under the Montreal Protocol but also have high global warming potential. Internationally, of course, these gases are regulated under separate regimes, but in California, we had the flexibility to incorporate that into the cap-and-trade program there. And then finally, 2 different types of methane capture and destruction from livestock operations and from mines, primarily coal mines in the country. There's another methodology under consideration that we expect to be adopted later this year that concerns methane emissions from rice cultivation. One drawback of this approach, although there have been some advantages, of course, I think, in having a more streamlined system, but what it has meant is that supply, the potential supply, is more constrained. So it's really only these 5 and maybe 6 categories of offsets in the system right now. And if we go to the next slide, you can kind of see what that means in terms of can we get to that 8% maximum demand? And what this slide is showing, so the blue section at the top are the project types that do not currently count in the California compliance program. Those are credits that we have issued or will issue in the future that are purely voluntary. So there are some categories of offsets like landfill methane that we have developed protocols for, but they don't count in the California program. But the orange section, those are from project categories that do count. And you can see that even under this, what I would say now is a fairly optimistic projection, once you get out to 2016, we might barely be able to meet that 8% maximum demand. More likely, the total supply under these offset categories is going to fall short of what could be the maximum demand for offsets. So that's potentially a problem as we look out further into the future of the ETS. If the cap does start to become more binding and there's more scarcity, if the price goes up, it's not clear whether there will be a sufficient supply of offsets to meet that demand. So that's one thing to be concerned about. Now, the one sort of countervailing factor here is the fact that California did create this kind of unique pipeline of early action offset credits under my organization's program for the voluntary market. So right now, credits that my program has issued in those 5 project categories over the years, going back to about 2007, those credits are now eligible to be converted into compliance offsets. So they're now in the process of being converted, and you can see that yellow graph there is the cumulative number of credits that we've issued in those eligible categories. It was ramping up pretty rapidly, and now it's started to go down. And the reason it's going down is those credits are being converted into the green compliance carbon offset credits at this point. So the compliance credits compliance program is ramping up. The voluntary program is ramping down in those categories. And that pipeline of credits is alleviating some of the supply pressures that might have been there at the outset of the program. Basically, there was a ready supply available for anybody who wanted to go out and purchase offsets. And a number of entities, regulated entities, have started to do that. But some obstacles remain. So notwithstanding that pipeline of available credits that are there, I think we have run into some hiccups, maybe some cautionary notes for Korea and other programs that are developing offset programs. One is simply building up the administrative capacity. So my organization, we've been operating a carbon offset program for many years now. But at the Air Resources Board, the regulators that oversee this market, they have less experience. But they nevertheless are in charge of this program. They've delegated some of the administrative responsibilities. So my organization and 2 other organizations are now helping to process projects and at least initially issue credits. And the idea was that given the lack of capacity among the regulator's office, they could delegate some of the procedural steps to my organization and others. But at the same time, they have been reluctant to essentially delegate all the authority for reviewing these projects. And it's been a learning curve for them to come up to understand offset projects, and particularly when there are issues with a project where maybe it's slightly different from what the protocol envisions. They have to offer interpretive guidance, and it's been a slow process coming up with that guidance. So there's been this learning process with the regulators just in terms of being able to really process projects and get them through the door. And so even though we do have this pipeline of pre-existing credits, it's been slow. In some cases, we've seen delays of up to a year in terms of getting them through the system and getting the compliance credits issued. The other maybe unique aspect of the program that's caused some frustration and concern is that California regulators decided to retain the authority to invalidate credits after they have been issued if it comes to light at a later date that there was some kind of error in the accounting or there was fraud committed or something of that nature. And so basically, if something comes up, the regulators have threatened to invalidate credits. And in fact, in one case, we've already seen some that have been invalidated. There was a facility involved with the destruction of ozone-depleting substances called Clean Harbors. And they had some permitting violations. And so initially there were about 4 million credits that were under review because of these permitting violations. There was nothing wrong with the offsets themselves, but the destruction facility had run afoul of some permits. At the end of the day, the Resources Board decided that out of that 4 million, it would only invalidate close to 90,000. But while this was going on, it created a huge amount of uncertainty in the market. Basically, transactions, project development, and everything froze for half a year while they were reviewing this case and trying to figure out what to do. So that's had a chilling effect on the market. And even now, even though it was a small percentage of credits that were invalidated, there's still some fear within the market about whether when and whether they will invalidate credits in the future. So that's some cause for concern with the Californian experience. Partly as a result of some of these unique aspects of the program, we've seen a really stratified market in California. So what this slide is showing is the market rates for different types of credits in the, basically in the transition from the voluntary market into the compliance market. So on the far right, you'll see what the clearing prices are now for California allowances, CCAs. Those are trading at around $12 to $13 per ton. For compliance offsets, they're trading at a discount to that. And that's largely because of this invalidation policy. There's this risk that those credits may be invalidated. And you can see in the middle there, the column on the left, those are standard offsets without any guarantees. They're trading at under $10. There are some marketers offering guaranteed offsets, so they will guarantee the credits against the invalidation risk. Those credits are trading at a higher rate, but still a little bit less than the allowance price. And then way over on the left, you'll see the voluntary credits, the CRTs that my organization issues. Those face a risk of perhaps not being converted into compliance units. Also, perhaps the risk of being invalidated, so the going price for them is significantly lower. So what this means is it's a complicated market. Whether it's good or bad, I suppose, depends on your perspective. On the one hand, it opens up some opportunities for getting some real bargains. If you're a compliance entity and you want to purchase offsets, you can get them pretty cheaply. But if you do that, you want to do your homework and make sure that you know how to manage the risk associated with getting those credits converted and avoiding invalidation. So looking forward, again, at the outset of the program in California, we've had some fairly lenient caps. They're not super over-allocated, but there's some breathing room there, which means the prices in the market have been pretty close to the floor price that California has established in their auctions. In effect, that means there's not a huge demand for offsets, although there are still opportunities for getting some bargains out there. But there have been some supply constraints, and the reason that it hasn't been a major issue is in part because of the lenient caps at the outset. The floor price that California has established is creating some incentive for project developers, so we are still seeing projects going forward, being developed, credits being issued. So the offset market is active, even given the lenient caps. But looking out further we do see some potential for some real shortages once the cap starts to decline. I think the takeaways here, it's really important to build administrative capacity among the regulators. It's important for the regulators to provide timely and clear guidance related to offset projects and invalidation risk in California. Looking forward, it's going to be important to adopt more protocols. So we have taken this top-down approach. If we really want to see greater supply, we're going to see more project types. And that may include looking at international offsets as well, which has been on the table in California, but so far there's been limited political will to link internationally. So we'll see where that goes in the future if we do start to see some supply shortages.